Hello and good evening, everybody. We want to thank you for joining us this evening for our 6th episode of Inspire and Inform. Tonight, I'm joined by Andrew again to discuss really the 5 main ways to replace your income and just really a discussion about which is the right way for you. To be very open, Andrew put this presentation together just today, just based on a few things we've chatted about. And I'm very excited to be able to discuss this. But tonight it'll be largely driven by Andrew. Andrew is really one of our key team members at Inspire Realty. And I love him because he's got just the brains of someone who really goes into depth and detail about investment modalities and looking at the property investment as a whole. So I'm very excited. Please welcome Andrew to the show. Andrew, thank you for joining us tonight, and I'm looking forward to your sharing tonight.
Thanks very much, Colin. It's an interesting topic I picked tonight, and I think, I guess with a lot of people feeling the impacts of COVID-19, we've had some more outbreaks in Victoria over the past few days, and changes to lockdown laws and restrictions to movement. I think a lot of people have used this time, well, hopefully they've used this time to reflect on, I guess, and take stock of where they are in their journey, and what steps and what actions that they need to take or want to take towards building a better future for themselves. And one of the lessons out of COVID-19, particularly with the rising unemployment rate we're seeing in Australia, the amount of people on JobKeeper, JobSeeker, is the concept of, I guess, getting a bit of I guess I view it as really a snapshot as to tackling the question of where does the income come for us to support our lifestyle once we decide to finish working. And it's obviously been thrust upon many people, and many people don't have too many choices, and they're at the moment, and they're required to take advantage of the government assistance that's available to them. But I think it can also be viewed through that lens of, well, what am I doing in order to have the ability to suddenly switch off work? And if I ever encounter another situation like COVID-19 in the future, what am I going to be able to do? Am I going to be able to maintain that lifestyle? So I really wanted to tackle that question. And to be fair, with a lot of variations in between, there's really 5 main ways for people to be able to build up the asset base that's going to be able to deliver them the passive income that they're looking to maintain their lifestyle. And I wanted to really dive into those methods or ways to build up a capital base, and really compare them against each other, and just share with you some of the insights and some of the reasons ultimately, in my own personal circumstances, that I chose to use property investment as the vehicle for me to do exactly what I'm going to be sharing tonight. But just wanted to put a very quick disclaimer out there. There's no one way to do it. Every person is going to have different scenarios, and different ways and methodologies in order to achieve the same objective. But for the vast majority of people, in order to replace their income or live off passive income, or whichever way that you want to say it, one of the key or the common ingredients is to build up that capital base. And the ways to do that, we're going to cover in tonight's presentation. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to cover what's actually required, because just like any journey in life, one of the most important things that you need to do is begin with the end in mind. I know I've spoken about that over and over again in past sessions, but it really is critical. So, and we're going to tackle the common mindset around wealth that, hey, well, what I need to do is I need to tighten up the purse strings and focus on saving money in order to be able to have some money to live off and use for lifestyle. So we'll tackle that's method number one. Method number two, in Australia, we're very blessed to have a superannuation system in place where we're making compulsory contributions into our superannuation in an effort to provide for us in retirement and not have to rely on the age pension. So we'll look at that and explore that as a method towards building up that capital base to provide for our futures. And then the three main ways that people build up that capital base outside of super is either through building a business, and we'll have a look at some of the pros and cons and some of the challenges associated with that. And I will share some of my own personal experiences in business. Next one along is probably an age-old debate, to be honest. Should I invest in shares or should I invest in property? And we'll look at, again, some of the pros and cons of both, and sort of people will get a really good understanding around what might be the right vehicle. But they're really the five main ways that people use to build up a capital base: saving, superannuation, building a business, investing in shares, and investing in property. Now there are some other ways that people have chosen and have done that, but for the average Joe Blow Australian, that's probably the five main methods that are available. We're going to be using a consistent case study to try and really put these methods up against each other. So I'm going to assume that in our case study, we have $100,000 worth of capital available to us. We're going to assume that each of the methods of investment give us a 7% capital growth. And for the purposes of tonight, we're simply going to park the conversation around yields, a yield from property investment or dividends from shares, the cash flow component. And we're going to really hone in and focus in on the capital growth side of things. And of course, we're going to be talking about some things, taxation and returns. And for those of you that don't like numbers, there may be a few spreadsheets in there tonight. I'm a big fan of spreadsheets. It really helps me to understand and tell a story to myself and really get a good comprehension about what's going on. So the information we're going to be sharing with you is general in nature, doesn't constitute financial advice, as we really don't have a good understanding about everyone that's watching's personal circumstances.
I think also, Andrew, I think it's worth noting that these are all the different methods, predominantly the four that we're going to be talking about. Just to reiterate your point about replacing your income. Sometimes I label that as retirement. So whatever that means for you, it's just the vehicle that will help you to build a wealth to replace your income or whatever you're earning to be able to maintain the lifestyle. It's worth noting that it's good to diversify. I mean, I have investments in all those different areas in my super. Obviously running a business with Inspire Realty, with the super, I'm investing in shares, and I obviously got a portfolio of properties. So it just may mean that you invest a little bit heavier on one, depending on what your situation and circumstances. But I'd like to be able to say, hey, if you can invest in all of them, you can invest in all of them to diversify. You just got to know what the risk versus the rewards are and what works best for your situation.
Correct. 100%. And again, I'm a big, within my own portfolio, I do have diversification in both business shares and property investment. And I'll share some of those insights tonight.
Mm-hmm.
But again, going back to beginning with the end in mind, this is a sheet that we've shared in previous sessions. So what does it mean if we want to try and achieve $100,000 worth of passive income? Well, again, I'll make the point that it's not really about $100,000 worth of money or pure dollars and cents coming in. It's really about the spending power of that $100,000. So at some time in the future, we want to be able to buy the equivalent of what we could buy with $100,000 cash today at some stage in the future. So what that means is we really need to adjust for inflation, because the value of what you can buy for the same dollar amount diminishes over time. So in this case, we've adjusted for inflation at 3%, and I've assumed that I can return on my capital base 5% return, which is a little bit more conservative than some of the other assumptions that we're going to be using in tonight's examples of 7%. But what does that mean? Well, it means that we don't need $100,000 coming in passive income in 20 years' time. We need $180,000 coming in. And at 5% return on our equity, that means we need about $3.6 million worth of net equity in 20 years' time to achieve our $100,000. That's quite a large number. And a lot of people look at numbers like that and they say, well, that's just impossible. And using, I guess, the first method of trying to achieve passive income for your retirement or when you decide to stop working, that means that we would need to save $180,000 every year after tax for the next 20 years. Now, this is the point that most people that haven't really explored any other methods towards achieving this, well, let's call it an audacious goal, because it really is, think, my goodness, I can never do that, and I might as well give up. So I guess the moral of the story is, if you're looking to have the ability to replace your income, probably going to be fairly hard to save your way there. I don't know too many people that can save $180K a year every year after tax. So moving on to, I guess, method number 2, the super or the age pension. If you choose not to undertake any of these methods and simply rely on the government to support your lifestyle once you decide to stop working or once you're of age, the maximum amount for a couple is about $35,000 per annum. Now, I don't know about any of you listening out there, but for me, after working so hard for 20, 30, 40 years of my life, I think that I deserve a little bit more than that coming in to support my lifestyle once I decide to finish working. And the situation's even worse for singles, $23,000 per year. So it's not too much of a lifestyle. It's not too many trips overseas that you're going to be able to live with that kind of money.
Can I just say though, Andrew, in Australia, the ASFA records that for a single person, we need about easily $40,000 to live fairly comfortably in Australia, in Sydney anyway.
That's assuming you've got your house paid off.
Exactly. I've just worked out very quickly while you were talking, the max age pension for couples being $35,000, that just works up to be about $670 a week for 2 people. That's not a lot to live on. Just worth noting.
Yeah, and the other point of that is, obviously, as a generation or the time frame that we're in, we're going through a little bit of a generational shift. The baby boomers are in their retirement phase at the moment, and for those of them that haven't really planned for their futures, like what we're talking about tonight, I think that's going to put a massive strain on government resources to be able to continue to provide an age pension at this level. So for those of you that are out there and haven't really taken action or put in place a plan for your future, don't rely on the age pension being there at all, because at some point, particularly as the baby boomers start to draw down on this, it may not be around.
That's right.
And then superannuation. The average superannuation on retirement for males is about $270,000, and for females, probably due to rearing children, is about $157,000 per annum. So what's that? 4 or 5 years? As a society, due to medical advances, etc., we're living longer than we ever have before. So that's not many years of retirement money that's available to us through our super. And one of the reasons behind this, and I just really wanted to unpack this, and I'm going to give you a case study on this, is depending on, I guess most Australian super is tied up into the share market. And so depending on how frequently the fund is actually trading your superannuation and the amount of fees that you pay each year, it really does have a significant impact on the actual returns that you're getting. Even though within superannuation, you're in a lower tax environment, and we'll really have a look at what that actually looks like. So I've put together a bit of an example here. Again, I'm sticking with the 7% capital growth rate. And I had a look up today, and some of the statistics said that the average management cost is about 1.1% of your total super balance per annum. And also included in this, as I mentioned, we're in a lower tax environment within super. So if we're realizing the gains that we're making every year, so that means that we're not holding our share trades for more than 12 months because of obviously changing markets, etc., which we really don't have too much control of as the average consumer. We put that in the hands of the fund that we have our super in. We may be realizing the gains that we're making each year, and therefore we're going to have to pay tax on them. So to give an example of what that looks like, so let's say we start.
Can I just pause you there for a second? It's worth noting, I've read in the news just very quickly today, the nation's largest super fund, Australian Super, they manage about $180 billion worth of Australian super. Do you know what the return on the last financial year is? Just have a guess.
No idea.
0.52%.
Wow.
Yeah, because it's just been averaged out with the latest COVID hit. 0.52%. Can you imagine?
Wow.
With a super? So it's just worth,
You're losing money. You're losing money there because you're not keeping up with inflation.
That's right. So I know San Andrew, that's very rich for now, but we'll go with that.
Yeah, well, we've got to make it fair for everyone. But the other point, just to sort of extend a little bit further on what you were saying, Colin, was that because of and nothing against any of the industry funds or out there. But really, by allowing the industry fund to manage your retirement money, if you're putting all your eggs in the super basket, you're really delegating control and responsibility to someone else. And I'm a big advocate of taking control of your own future. But going back to this example, so let's say we've got $100,000 in our superannuation and we're not making any contributions to try and, I guess, highlight the point here. If we make our 7% return, that means in year one we make $7,000, but we've got to pay our 1.1% management fee. So we have to deduct our $1,100. Our profit, $5,900. We need to pay tax on that at 15% if we've traded, if we're not holding our shares, and within our portfolio, $885. So we make about $5,000 gain. And the same situation goes down. As you can see, our profit is increasing, and that's because of the power of compounding. So we're compounding our returns. But the challenge is we're taking off every year our management fees and our tax, and that reduces the impact of the compounding effect. So that means over 20 years, we end up with about $266,000 from our $100,000 investment. And we'll see in other examples how much of an impact that actually makes.
Wow, and this is at a 7% growth rate.
7% growth rate. So the average rule of thumb, as you know, Colin, is that if something grows at 7%, it doubles every 10 years. And so if we took out the management costs and the taxation out of that, this scenario, we should have ended up with $400,000 over a 20-year period.
Thank you for that, Andrew.
No problems. So what about building a business? So a lot of you may have heard, I guess, the failure rate, or more than half or more than 50% of businesses fail within the first 5 years. And there's a number of reasons for that, which I'm not going to unpack in this session. But one of the things I really wanted to share with everyone is some work with that was done by Robert Kiyosaki, who's famous for his cash flow quadrant. And the reason why I'm so passionate about sharing this point is it's something that I've had experience about myself. So when I was starting out in business many years ago now, I very much had the mindset that building up a business asset was my path towards financial freedom, to gain this passive income that is available or to provide for my future. And so prior to starting up the business, I started out as an employee. And then I went out and I was self-employed. And the reason why those two, the employee and the self-employed, are on the left-hand side of the quadrant is that your income that you earn is completely derived by the amount of hours you work. Basically, you're trading time for money. And to make that transition across to the right-hand side of the quadrant in business in particular, and we'll talk about investor later, is very difficult to remove yourself from the business. And that's why a lot of people start on the left-hand side of the quadrant, particularly in business. They become self-employed. They say, oh, I don't want to answer to anyone. They're all gung-ho. But what I realize is it's very difficult to turn it into trading time for money into an asset that provides passive income to become a business owner. And so at one stage, I had a golf and a courier business, and I was working so hard to keep on growing and growing those businesses. But I realized as soon as I stopped working, the income stopped. And so for me, my decision was that business wasn't going to be that vehicle. For me, business was on the cash flow side, which I would need to put money into the investment side, which we'll get into now.
Yeah. Andrew, it's also worth noting that I've also started as an employee, and I've become a business owner thinking that my business could run itself and replace my income. But little did I know that it takes a lot of effort, time, blood, sweat, and tears, disappointment, ups and downs, and sometimes many mistakes to transition from E to B. And I'm still on that journey. Can't say I'm fully a business owner where it self-perpetuates. But I think the idea here is that as an employee, exchanging time for money is limited. So you've got to get your money to work a little bit smarter for you, which is where the self-employed, rather the investor side of things would come in really handy, because as an employee and self-employed, you're really exchanging time for money, like you said, Andrew, and it's only limited. So it's about seeing how you can transition into the right side of the quadrant, which is what Robert Kiyosaki is very much purporting.
Correct. And for me, I found it a little bit easier to transition across to the investor side as opposed to the business side. So what about shares, speaking of the investor side? So I did a little bit of research, and I wanted to get a really good understanding about what is actually the size of the Australian stock market. So as you can see here, or maybe it's a little bit hard to read, but the Australian stock market value overall, every single stock within Australia, the ASX, is valued at about $1.3 trillion. Now, once you start going from millions to trillions, the amount of zeros, it becomes a little bit mind-boggling. But to put that into some sort of context, the US stock market is valued at about $26.1 trillion. So Australia the Australian stock market is tiny compared to the US. And it's interesting that share trading mindset, a lot of the literature that is out there around wealth and money creation, because of the size and the population of the US versus Australia, is quite often very US centric. And that means it focuses quite a lot around stocks and share trading. But the interesting side of things is, if we compare it to Australia, the residential property market is valued at about 7.2 trillion. So it's about a good 4 or 5 times the size of the Australian share market. Australians definitely have an affinity, a love affair with property. It's very much part of the Australian psyche, and it's one of the reasons that property has got such a good track record in terms of capital growth in Australia. But the other point I really wanted to make around the share market, and I was just sharing this with Colin before we came on air, and I didn't actually know this, but I did some research about how much of that share market is actually traded each day. And it's about $5.6 billion of shares are traded each day on the Australian stock market. But what does that really mean? And that's where this whole conversation, it took me a little while and I had to get the calculator out to put that in context of the billions and trillions. But what that means is, on average, the Australian stock market's open about every 260 days out of 365 each year. So that means on average, the entire Australian stock market turns over once every year. It's traded around. So there's a lot of, I guess, volatility and liquidity within the Australian stock market. And then you compare that against property, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here, probably about an average annual turnover of only 6.5%. And we'll get into some of the reasons why that is. But what I really take out of that is the stock market has a very high liquidity, high volatility, because lots of trade going along, and it's high and it's very transparent. You can look up, and I'm guilty of doing this myself, looking up your share portfolio every minute of the day to see what it is. And then when there's a shift, it's really transparent. It's right in front of your eyes. It's reported on the nightly news. And it's very easy to get shaky and forget why you made that investment in the first place. And it's very easy to hit the sell button. And that's why a lot of people struggle to use share trading as their vehicle towards wealth. But the other problem is, I guess we're talking about beginning with the end in mind. We started out with an objective of having a $3.8 million capital base. And it's very difficult, and because of that volatility, quite risky in some, unless you really know what you're doing. And I'm not saying it's impossible. And there's plenty of people, and plenty of people I know out there that have done this, but to use leverage when it comes to share trading. Because most people are not starting out with quite such a large capital base. They're making small bets, maybe 10,000 here, 5,000 there. And regardless of the returns in terms of percentage that they're getting, it's very difficult for them to be able to achieve the amount of wealth or build that capital base up to a level without leverage that's going to be able to provide for their future. And also, going back to this chart here, in terms of the volatility side, 5-10% swings in short periods of time, or 20% swings or 40% swings is well, I wouldn't say it happens every day, but there's there's that volatility, and it really makes you question yourself. And this is one of the exercises I'm doing. Just to share on my personal side, I have all my superannuation invested into shares, which I proactively manage, and on my personal side, I'm heavily invested in property. But one of the challenges that I'm setting myself is to overcome this mindset as I see these large swings, particularly now this time through COVID-19, to remind myself, okay, well, this is why I made the trade, and this is why what I'm looking to do, and I'm forcing myself to hold on amidst all this volatility. But for the average Joe Blow, I think that's, throws a lot of challenges.
It's funny, Andrew, I actually had a client that asked me today, yesterday, and she said to me, well, Colin, I'd love to diversify my portfolio a little bit. She saved up a little bit of money now. She goes, well, can I allocate a little bit of that into shares? And what would that mean? Mainly because she wanted a sense of autonomy with the amount of money that she can trade. So it's, she feels like she want to have a little bit more control over the shares. And I made the point that shares, a bit like property, it does grow in the long term if you buy the right shares, but you don't really get to, if you wanted to trade that every day, that's more of an active involvement versus a passive involvement. So I think that's where there's a slight difference. So talking about shares, you are making small bets, but you're also actively involved in it if you wanted to trade and have some sort of autonomy over share trading.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think we're going to go a little bit over tonight, but I think this is good stuff. So let's keep going. Okay, so what does that look like? It's actually interesting. It's quite a similar scenario to the superannuation side. So again, we're starting out with $100,000 worth of shares. And like most investors, a lot of people that would invest with $100,000 are taught the value of diversification. So let's say this share investor split it into 10 different stocks, and they're trading at around maybe once a year. So each time you actually trade, there's a couple of things happen. Number one, there's some costs to trading. So you have to pay some fees, some brokerage fees. So let's assume each trade costs you $30. And also when you realize any profits that you make, you need to pay tax on that particular profit. But this time we're outside of super, so we're paying PAYG tax. So I've just taken a middle ground. I've said, let's look at the 32.5% tax bracket. So let's have a quick look at what that situation might look like. So again, $100,000 invested. Again, a 7% capital gain, $7,000. Our trading costs $300 because we've traded 10 times. We make $6,700 profit. We've got to pay 32.5% tax on our profit. So we make $4,500. So again, fast forwarding that 20 years, and one thing to keep in mind, we're assuming everything keeps absolutely constant like clockwork in a linear fashion every year. Never happens like that in reality, but this is designed to prove a point. We end up with $245,000 after 20 years.
Wow.
So quite a similar scenario to our super. So what about property? So property has quite a long track record. Again, we've covered Australia's love affair or affinity with property, and one of the reasons, and you can see on the right hand side, it has quite a similar trajectory or graph, or in terms of rate of return to the share market. So if we were simply to buy the share market and or a property, we've probably got a similar rate of return, but that doesn't really work out that way, and we'll dive into why. One of the reasons that the property market has a lower volatility to shares, so it doesn't go up and down as much on a daily or weekly basis, is that the property market, unlike the share market, which is comprised of 100% investors, is actually dominated by owner-occupiers. 70% of the residential properties in Australia are owned by owner-occupiers, not by investors. So in the property market, investors are price takers. Owner-occupiers are price makers. And the beauty of that is owner-occupiers, as many of you may know if you've gone out there and bought your own home, buy with their hearts, not their heads. And this is one of the reasons why we don't see property markets oscillating or so much volatility compared to the share market. And to sort of double down on that, one of the other reasons that we don't see property having quite as much volatility is that the transaction costs, the cost to buy and sell and trade property, is extremely high. You've got stamp duty, capital gains tax, and a whole number of things. And that's one of the reasons why we see a 6.5% turnover or transaction rate of the Australian property market versus over a course of a year versus 100% for shares. So this really almost forces the investor to buy and hold over the long term. And the second thing, the next thing is you're able to leverage your investment. Banks are willing to lend 80, 90% of your investment or the purchase price of the property for you to invest in property. And this really helps, number one, amplify the return. But from another perspective, the banks are so fantastic, the deal. The banks are almost saying, hey, I'll take 80 to 90% of the risk by lending you the money, but you get to keep 100% of the capital gains simply for the price of paying a little bit of interest. So to me, that's a fantastic deal. And the most important thing here is the tax. You only pay tax on your capital gains when you sell the property, not every year. And that's the key one of the key differences. So let's have a look in terms of numbers, how that actually impacts our $100,000 investment that we've been using as a case study. And just a reminder, this is not designed to be dollar accurate. It's designed to demonstrate the point of leverage and compounding over long-term investments. And again, when you do see the numbers I'm about to share with you, there's no one best method for building wealth for yourself to provide for your future. It's going to be unique to your circumstances. And with any of these, the other important point is that nothing in life comes easy. There's going to be challenges that are thrown at you along the way. All of these charts make it, maths and numbers make it look so easy and simple. But the reality is today it's coronavirus, tomorrow it'll be something else. There'll always be challenges. And that's why beginning with the end in mind is so important. So let's have a look at the numbers. So again, we're assuming a 7% capital growth rate. We're going to buy a property for $500,000, so we put a 20% deposit down. Our interest rate that we're going to assume, because obviously if we're borrowing money, we've got to pay interest back to the bank, a 4% interest rate. And also we're probably going to have some other holding costs, rates and strata if we buy an apartment, etc. So we're going to assume that's 2% of the property value. And again, we're assuming a tax rate at 32.5%. So we buy our $500,000 property, we borrow $400,000 from the bank, and we have our $100,000 net equity, which is our deposit that we put down. We have to pay interest on our $400,000 that we borrow from the bank, so that's $16,000 at 4%. Our other holding cost of 2% of the property value, $10,000. So we've got a cash flow of negative $26,000 it costs us to hold this property, but we're not paying any tax. So again, that property goes up in value over year 2, 535. That's our 7% gain. We still have some additional holding costs because our 2% percentage goes up a little bit, even though we're paying the same interest. Again, we paid no tax. So what does it all mean when it flows down? We end up, our property after 20 years growing at 7% is now worth $1.8 million. Our loan is still $400,000. I've assumed we're paying interest only, which means we've got $1.4 million worth of net equity. But obviously it's cost us some money that in order to hold on to this property over that long term. So it's cost us $729,000 in interest and holding costs. And again, I haven't factored in that we're gaining any rent or anything like that in this scenario. So the numbers in real life will be a little bit different, but this is designed to demonstrate a point. So on that $1.4 million, we'll have to pay capital gains tax, but because we've held that property over the 20 years, we obviously get some discounts, etc., but we only pay that capital gains tax at the end. So when we sell it after 20 years' time, not each year. So that means we end up with about $1.2 million. Over this time, we would have got some negative gearing benefits. So we actually use that as a tax deduction. So it costs, we've probably spent out of pocket $492,000. Again, not assuming zero rent coming in. So what does that mean after 20 years? $767,000. Now, where does that come from? That's the power of compounding and letting that as well as leverage. But it's particularly with the compounding. It's not paying tax. It's not taking any deductions off our base amount and only paying tax at the end. Couple that with the power of leverage or borrowing, and that is the net result. And compare that to the other two methods without leverage and paying tax as we go. We're at $250,000 versus $760,000 net after 20 years. It makes a massive difference. And when I saw these numbers and started doing these calculations myself, that is where I decided property investment was going to be the vehicle for me in order to build my long-term wealth. Any comments, Colin?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you so much for this. I mean, I've seen similar graphs like this, but I guess it's good to be able to see it as a big picture. You know, comparing the same rate of return at 7% for shares, superannuation versus property. Some may argue, though, that 7% property growth for the next near future would be a little bit high on the rate of return. So I only encourage you, if you wanted to be, if you are a little bit more conservative and you think it's going to be more of a 5% growth rate, and it's not going to double every 10 years. We want to be able to show you the situation that pertains to your own particular situation as well. Like you said, Andrew, this doesn't actually count for rent, which I think makes up a big portion of something you need to really account for in investing in property, because that's an income generating asset, which is what an investment is, according to Robert Kiyosaki. So I think there's a lot of things that are a lot more detailed, and I like how on a very high level you've really showed us and painted a picture that property is a safe investment as long as you invest it in the long term. It's less volatile, as you've mentioned, and less traded, because not only have you got to pay capital gains, but you've got to pay agents' fees, and the time frame it takes to sell a property potentially discourages you from having to sell a property. And I realized I've learned something. 70% of properties are owned by owner occupiers, so there is less of the emotional reason to have to trade the property if they're predominantly owned by owner occupiers. So thank you so much for that, Andrew. This is absolutely wonderful.
No problem.
Like I said before, if there is a situation and you want to be a little bit conservative about some of those numbers, we're happy to sit down with you and look at that and work out what's best in your scenario.
Yeah, that's right. And, again, it's horses for courses. The 3 simple steps to taking action or getting to work towards building a better future for yourself. Work out where you're at, where you want to be, put a plan in place. Consider building a team around you to help support, because like any professional athlete, they have a support team around them. It's just like anything that you want to achieve in life. And then finally, take action. It doesn't matter which path you start out on, which path you end up on. The point is, if you don't take any action at all, you're never going to get there, and there's never going to be a perfect time. So if you have, I guess the message I wanted to finish with, I know we've gone a little bit over, is if you have any questions around property finance, wealth creation, want to run a particular scenario past us, or just want a bit more clarification, or want to delve into your personal circumstances, whatever it is for you, the whole reason why we started doing these Facebook Lives was to add value to people. So 2 ways that you can do that. Firstly, throw a comment on Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're watching this, and we'll personally respond to you. Or secondly, visit our website at inspirerealty.com. You have the opportunity to schedule a 45-minute strategy session with Colin and myself to go through your personal scenario, and also ask any questions that you want. And there's some other pretty cool free resources we put together to really just add value in any way that we possibly can. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Colin, for letting me speak so much and holding your tongue. I know that's difficult for you. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Have a good night, mate.